Welcome to day one of the Imagine Belfast Festival of Ideas and Politics. I'm Alan Meban, and it's my pleasure to be speaking today to political scientist, political economist, political theorists, Dr. Francis Fukuyama. You're a senior fellow at Stanford University, a very well-respected author and speaker. And Francis, you are most welcome to the Imagine Belfast Festival today. I'm going to come on to the political theory and the books in a minute, but maybe just so we get to know our guest a little bit. I mean, what originally piqued your interest in politics and your interest in political theory? What started you off?
Well, I was a humanities student when I was an undergraduate. I actually was a classics major. It was a kind of 19th century humanistic education, so I learned Greek primarily and Latin so that I could read Plato and Aristotle. It started me off as a very theoretical person, but then we were in the middle of the Cold War in the late 70s and 80s, and international affairs, seemed to me an urgent issue. And so I made a transition from theory into more policy-related things. So that was the start.
You've never regretted that you didn't spend more time with Plato? No.
No, it's actually pretty hard to earn a living studying Plato. So I'm content what I ended up doing.
It's, I think last year was the 30th anniversary of the publication of The End of History and The Last Man. Give us just a little gist of the argument. I think most people probably who are with us today will be familiar with it, but just give us a little bit of the gist of what you were trying to say, and then we'll talk a bit about whether it's still working today.
Well, sure. So the argument, the idea of history with a capital H is really a philosophical idea that comes from Hegel and Marx, and these thinkers that believe that there was progress, that human societies evolved and changed over time. And so the end of history was the question, in what direction was that evolution, that modernization occurring? And for many decades, the Marxists believed that the end of history would be communism. That's the direction in which societies were moving. And what I argued back in 1989 was it didn't look like we were going to get to communism, that if there was an end of history anywhere, it was going to be something like liberal democracy and a market economy. And that, was the fundamental argument that I made back then. And I still think the essence of it is true, despite the challenges that liberal democracy has faced in the present moment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess events around the world on a small scale always kind of challenge the edges of arguments, but I mean, even Putin flexing his military muscle at the moment, that really doesn't do anything to aid the cause of communism.
Well, it's pretty clear that communism is not going to be the end of history. The real challenges right now are actually coming from the right, from nationalists, from religious nationalists like Modi in India, that say that a liberal society that tolerates, different ways of life is not enough, that we need a society where everybody's marching in the same direction with the same national identity, with the same religion. That's really been the biggest challenge over the last few years. And I think it's really the reason that I wrote my last book, which was a defense of classical liberalism, because I think people need to be reminded about why that's still an important and, even necessary doctrine.
Yeah, I've been reading. I've been doing my homework and kind of reading. I like your precision, because not only, I mean, history in one title, it has a specific kind of meaning, but the fact checker in me kind of realizes a lot of our articles all begin with having to say, well, somebody said this. Now, first of all, what does this phrase mean? Because it's important to kind of tie down what you mean. And so liberalism, I guess if you're in the UK or Ireland, you might think of parties that have the word liberal in their title, or you might use it as an insult to say that you're a wishy-washy liberal. But actually, what do you mean by liberalism? What are we defined as in this conversation?
No, it's important to specify that, because it has different meanings. In the United States, a liberal means that you're left of center. Whereas in continental Europe, it means that you're center-right, like the German Free Democrats. I have a broader definition of liberalism that would encompass both of those, actually, that a liberal believes that there's an equality of human dignity, that all human beings have a certain minimal respect that they're owed, and that the way that you protect that dignity is through a rule of law, through rights that are recognized and defended by the state. And, you know, in the economic sphere, liberals believe in markets and private property, but you can have a relatively large state, or you can have a relatively small one and still be a liberal as long as you have that fundamental rule of law that does protect individuals from overarching government power.
I mean, the European community, which became the European Union of these days, I mean, it is founded on those kind of liberal principles, yes?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think that, you know, people appreciate liberal principles when they've been subjected to the opposite. And after World War II, Europe had fought these two terrible world wars based on clashing strong versions of national identity. And the European Union was intended in some way to get beyond that, to return to a liberal world order in which nations could trade with one another and interact peacefully rather than, you know, trying to conquer one another. Unfortunately, today, we seem to be cast back into something of that pre-1945 world with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we haven't really left, you know, that old great power politics world yet.
Yeah, and I guess we'll kind of come back to it in some sense, but yes, people who have power do tend to kind of abuse it, no matter what kind of ideology they're working on. It would seem. Your book, you're kind of looking at some of the threats, some of the weaknesses, some of the, I guess, the poor implementations of liberalism and kind of liberal democracies. There aren't really any perfect ones, are they? I mean, it's a very human set of governments.
Well, I think the problem in the last few decades is that good liberal principles were really carried to extremes. So one example of that is what's been called neoliberalism. It's not a synonym for capitalism. It's a more extreme version of market capitalism that was exemplified by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, that saw the state as simply an obstacle to economic freedom, and you wanted to minimize the state and turn everything over to, you know, to private initiative. And I think that was simply carried too far, and it produced a economic world with very substantial inequalities, with a lot of instability as, you know, financial markets were deregulated. And so that was one extreme. The other extreme tended to come out of the left, where, you know, liberal society is built around protection of individual autonomy, but people interpreted that increasingly as a kind of unlimited autonomy, that people ought to be able to choose any aspect of their lives in a way that tended to erode the common ties that are necessary really to hold any society together. And, you know, that produced also a reaction. So the neoliberalism produced a left-wing counter-reaction to, you know, economic inequality. And I think the you know, the left-wing interpretation produced a right-wing opposition that we now see in these culture wars that are being fought in many liberal societies.
Yes, culture wars that don't feel terribly liberal in any definition of the thing. I was struck by a bit at the end. It's the bottom of page 62 if anybody's following along at home, but the end of The Sovereign Self, you talk about some of the threats, and the first is a belief in the sovereignty of the individual deepens liberalism's tendency to weaken other forms of communal engagement, and in particular turns people away from the virtues like public spiritedness that are needed to sustain a liberal polity overall. I mean, it strikes me in a world of climate change or climate crisis, depending on your kind of on your terminology, we're in a world where we need people to effectively do things together, to do things communally, to everybody play their part, and yet the kind of me culture really doesn't suit that, because I only need to do what I need to do, and everybody else, you know, to hell with them. So it doesn't seem like a form, an ideology that sometimes the outworking of it is particularly suited for the moment.
Yeah, there's a right-wing and a left-wing version of that resistance to collective action. You know, the right-wing one is pretty evident in distrust of the state or fear of the state, and that whatever the state does has got to be wrong. But there's a left-wing distrust of the state. You know, it's been captured by corporate interest, that it doesn't really represent the people, or else there's a belief that, citizens need to participate at every single level of activity, to the point where you actually can't make decisions and you can't, do the kinds of big projects that are necessary, for example, to deal with climate. I mean, we have lots of examples of that in the United States where, you can't build the electrical power grids and the charging stations and the things like that that are really going to be needed to decarbonize. And so I think there's two different versions, both from either, end of the ideological spectrum that prevent collective action.
And is this, I mean, in a sense, do we have neoliberalism on one side and neoconservatism? We're kind of fighting each other for whether it's about me, whether it's about our kind of government intervention and kind of reaching out to corporates and things. Is this the kind of the balance, the uneasy balance that we have?
Well, I wish it were a balance. It seems to me more like a war.
Okay.
I mean, in the United States, right now, you have a certain form of identity politics. A lot of it, has centered recently around transgender issues, where there's a, belief that our autonomy should be so complete that we can simply, as a matter of individual choice, pick our gender. And that, by some activists is carried to the point where it overrides the will of parents. It becomes embedded in the educational system. And this then sets off a right-wing reaction where, people on the right then want to forbid that kind of education and ban certain books. And it's a terrible system that ends up being intolerant at both ends of the spectrum and eroding, the liberal principle of tolerance, which is really the core to, to a free society.
And I mean, does liberalism need to kind of do a better PR job? Does it need to start explaining to people actually what it's about and what it's meant to be, rather than letting the imperfect implementations of it kind of rule the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the reason I wrote my book.
Yeah.
Is
Buy
in a
more
way,
copies.
we've taken liberalism for granted for such a long time as the basis for a modern society, that I think a lot of people, particularly, younger Gen Z folks, never really understood why this doctrine appeared in the first place. If you look historically at the origins of liberalism, it came out of the European wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation, when Europeans spent, decades killing one another over issues like the doctrine of transubstantiation. Issues that seem completely irrelevant and foreign now, but they led to bloody conflicts. And early liberals said, rather than arguing over these religious doctrines defining the good life, let's just protect life itself and lower the temperature of politics by tolerating people that are different from us and have different opinions. And I think people have forgotten that core, that liberalism in a way was originally designed to promote religious toleration and pluralism. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it came to be a defense against strong forms of national identity, different kinds of aggressive nationalisms that had led to the two world wars. And the reason you had a liberal Europe after 1945 was exactly learning that lesson of the problems of having these strong forms of national identity and trading that for a liberal order in which people were allowed to, make their own choices. And that fundamental justification, I think, tends to get forgotten. It's been 70 years since the end of the war, several generations of, relative peace and prosperity. And I think people begin to take that liberal foundation for their peace and prosperity for granted.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, kind of religious wars, which seem to be some kind of contradiction in itself. But it's funny how often Martin Luther kind of turns up in your books, because actually it's a real moment, it's a real pivot moment of people's understanding and people's kind of actions. Talk to us a bit about democratic recession and whether, I mean, are we in one at the moment? When I look around the world, I see from your country, the remnant of Donald Trump and his potential resurgence. But if I look at Turkey and Erdogan, if I look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, there's just it does seem to be the time, if you wanted to be an authoritarian leader, this is this is your moment, and that's before we even get to kind of Putin.
Yeah, well, there's several dimensions to that. So there is this great power dimension where China and Russia have consolidated as decidedly authoritarian states that are trying to project their model beyond their borders. But, in a way, the more frightening possibility is within existing liberal democracies that it seemed to be fairly well consolidated.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump tried to overturn a democratic election in November, after November 2020. He fomented an insurrection, occupation of the Capitol, in order to prevent a peaceful transfer of power from happening. And, for one, I still cannot believe that this happened in the United States, and that somebody that tried to do this is still there and is going to run for president again, in 2024, and that people don't find this behavior, totally disqualifying for any kind of politician. And yet here we are. So I would say that that's a pretty serious threat to democracy in one of the oldest democracies in the world that we had thought was a model for other countries.
And can the US electoral system stand up to the kind of the beating that it's taking in terms of the stolen election narrative? I mean, it's not just that Trump and his cronies believe this, but I mean, a sizable proportion, still a minority, but a sizable proportion of voters think that their votes were stolen. It's not just paranoia. It's something that they really believe.
Yeah, well, I hope that the system will stand up. I think that the midterm election that we had last November was a good sign, because in at least a number of swing states, the election deniers were pretty clearly defeated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Trump himself increasingly seems like old news to a lot of Republican voters. But, as you say, I mean, there's still a good third of the country that believes that the last election was illegitimate. And it's very hard to have a democracy where that proportion of people mistrust, the most fundamental institution of a modern democracy.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck by the Lord Acton quote, which it kind of, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it seems to be whether or not you're backed by liberalism or some other ideology, this is true. People just kind of run with the model, but then make it their own, and the human weakness of wanting to be in charge and never letting go just takes over.
Yeah.
That's inevitable, isn't it? I mean, no matter what your ideology is, no matter what your framework is for government or for society, that's just, we have to live with that.
I think one of the principles of liberal government is to limit power by imposing a set of checks and balances so that nobody gets to exercise unlimited power. In the American system, we've got a constitution protecting individual rights. We've got separation of powers and so forth. And I think that those have worked reasonably well to prevent the concentration of power in a single individual. And, you can really see the terrible consequences of that in Russia and China, two countries that really have no meaningful checks against the power of their supreme leader. And so in the Russian case, you had the decision to invade Ukraine that seems to have just sprung out of Vladimir Putin's head. Even his closest advisors, his chief of staff and his foreign minister didn't know that he was actually really going to invade Ukraine until just before it happened. And in the case of Xi Jinping, you had a zero COVID policy that by the end was really, really counterproductive. But evidently nobody could stand up and tell him no, because of that concentration of power. And it took these widespread protests and resistance on the part of the Chinese population to finally convince him to change. But he's still there, Putin's still there. And I think the defects of illiberal decision-making are still very much apparent. And so that's why I think there is a real superiority, given, as you said, absolute power does tend to corrupt. The less absolute power you give people, the safer you are.
Yeah, and the quote even ends even better with a bit we rarely say, which is, great men are almost always bad men, which is kind of, I think Lord Acton was ahead of his time, or at least he's still very relevant. I mean, let's talk a bit more about Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it's the the invasion of Ukraine, which is really only the latest phase of kind of Putin went into Crimea before, so this is kind of just doing kind of pushing further in. You wrote about it kind of quite quickly after it started. You've continued to talk a lot about it. Are you surprised that the conflict has reached the 1 year mark and we're kind of now well past that? Did you think it would have kind of fizzled out much quicker, that it would have?
Well, so I have to explain that I've actually spent a lot of time in Ukraine and dealing with Ukrainians really since 2014, because all the way back then, I and some of my colleagues really felt that this was the biggest threat to democracy on a geopolitical level. And so we did a lot to help train, young leaders in Ukraine to build a better democracy. And from that experience, I really got a very strong sense that the Ukrainians really are proud of their sovereignty and their freedom. And I'm not surprised that they were so tenacious in defending it. What I am surprised was how successful they were and how incompetent the Russians have been, especially in military affairs, because they had been fighting the Russians really since 2014, not that successfully. And yet, after the war started, they were really able to liberate, impressive parts of their territory. I hope they keep doing that. Right now, we're in another very difficult phase of the war, which looks like it's heading towards stalemate, which I think would be very bad for Ukraine. But I do think that they're, likely to be able to break out of that, in the next few months. But that's really what we're going to have to wait and see right now.
I mean, on the Russian side, starting a war or participating in a war can be good for a leader in terms of their popularity. It's a very simple thing people can kind of gather around. But at the point where you kind of draft young men and women into an army and they start not coming home, that becomes more unpopular and people start to question. But is there any mechanism really within Russia for Putin to be challenged about his decisions, or is the fear is the kind of the state apparatus still too all-pervasive that just won't happen?
Well, yeah, I think the only real threat to him is going to come from within his own state. I mean, if someone in the intelligence services or the military just decides that he's led the country into perdition and really needs to be stopped in some way, whether that's bubbling under the surface, I think none of us know. I think we can't count on it. It's kind of a deus ex machina that, people are hoping for, but I don't think anyone can count on. And it's also the case that there are people that are, crazier than Putin, that are even stronger nationalists. And so even if he's replaced by somebody else, it's not clear that that's necessarily going to lead to a peaceful outcome. Mm-hmm. So at this point, I think we just don't know.
When we look at kind of Ukraine, are there dangers to its? People have obviously very much kind of rallied around their president. They've very much rallied. Some people have left the country, but some people have also come back home and saying they want to kind of build up either to work or to fight. But it's a much smaller pool of people to actually go for. I've been quite surprised that as a war. We're in the 21st century and we're fighting a war. Okay, there are some missiles and drones and things, but it's people in tanks, there are men dying kind of, on the ground. It's not a very modern kind of war. It's a very old-fashioned war. Do you think that'll kind of wear Ukraine down much faster than Russia? Even though Russia's kind of going to run out of prisoners at some point to put into militia, but
that's clearly Putin's hope that, he's got a country with 4 times the population of Ukraine, and that even if you lose, 4 Russians for every Ukrainian, that's still bad odds for a much smaller country. And that's the worry about this fighting that's been going on recently around Bakhmut, which has really been just a slugfest. It's been extremely costly for the Ukrainians. However, I think that you shouldn't overestimate Putin's reserves. Your own defense secretary said that 97% of the entire Russian army is in Ukraine right now, meaning that they don't have deep manpower reserves despite their population advantage.
Mm-hmm.
They've lost, maybe 2/3 of their armored vehicles in the fighting already. Part of the reason they have to do human wave attacks is they don't have enough, mechanized equipment, to really do a modern combined arms offensive. And so I think that we shouldn't overestimate the depths of Russian resources either. And that, is really, I think, what would give you hope that the Ukrainians could still break out of the current, stasis.
Mm-hmm. Are you comfortable with the, I suppose, the discomfort that the Ukrainians have that NATO is behind them, the West is behind them, but only so far, because they don't want to, NATO doesn't want to ever do something on Russian soil to accidentally or deliberately target that. And that's kind of, to Ukrainians, that must feel like they're kind of fighting with one hand behind their back. To NATO, that feels like not starting World War III. Are you comfortable with where that kind of balance is?
No, I've been critical of the way that Washington and NATO more broadly have been a little bit too cautious. They eventually make the right decision, but if they had done, like supplying longer range rocket artillery early on or tanks, I think that it would have helped Ukraine and avoided a lot of Ukrainian casualties. And so, they end up doing the right thing, but it's slow, and I think it's not something that is going to help Ukraine break out of the stalemate. I hope it's too late, for NATO to, turn that situation around.
Do you think there's any likelihood, though, that Putin's boldness says to China, they start thinking, well, actually, Taiwan, we could maybe do the same? Does Putin trying this encourage other authoritarian regimes to kind of do their thing? Because that would be quite. For me, sitting here, it's an easy thing to suggest. I know it's complicated, and American air bases, and it could become even worse than Ukraine. But is it likely?
I think that looking at this rationally from a Chinese perspective, it should make you worried about the risks that you'd be undertaking, because invading Taiwan is actually a much harder proposition than invading Ukraine was. But on the other hand, and I guess the other thing to say is that the invasion of Ukraine has actually stimulated a reaction on the other side that should also be chastening to the Chinese. So, for example, like Germany, Japan has basically announced a doubling of its defense budget, and they would not have done that if the Ukraine invasion hadn't happened. And Japan would actually be very crucial to any American attempt to help Taiwan defend itself. And so in that respect, it's had a deterrent effect. Nonetheless, I do think that in a way, Putin has broken this spell, this norm that said that big states don't just get up and invade, and grab territory from other states. That's a norm that's really held, at least in among great powers since 1945. And once you break that spell, maybe, Xi Jinping says, well, this is our opportunity and we better take it before it goes away.
Could be a while before liberal democracies start extending again. And again, that's a problem, isn't it, at the moment, because actually the number of places which are democratic like that are actually shrinking slightly. Now, not in huge terms, but kind of, one or two every decade are kind of reverting back.
Well, it's been, unfortunately, it's been more than that. And a lot of the early successes of democracy in Tunisia, in Myanmar, in a number of other places have now been reversed. And I think, most troubling is actually the two largest democracies, India and the United States, have seen these shifts towards a kind of illiberal populism in recent years. And so the democratic recession is something real. On the other hand, I don't think that we should assume that trend is going to go on forever. Hungary is pretty isolated within the European Union right now. And I think that in the United States, there has been this real pushback against, Trump and the kind of extremism that he represents. And I think most of all, the unity of NATO since the Russian invasion has surprised everybody, myself included. I wouldn't have thought that, there would be this kind of turnaround. So, I think it's important not to scare ourselves unduly or to get too pessimistic about the ability of democracies eventually to do the right thing.
Mm. If we kind of go a little bit away from world politics to social media and to, though these things are all related eventually, I'm sure we can bring liberalism back into it in some way, but you were writing in American Purpose magazine, the website, earlier on this month, you were writing about the crisis facing social media platforms. I guess we're thinking about Elon Musk and his takeover or decimation of Twitter and so on, and you were arguing that neither social media platforms nor the state can be counted on to regulate content. And as a kind of an IT person in my background, I'm kind of fascinated by your suggestion that kind of middleware could be the best approach. Now, I suspect this is one of these times when you need to define to the people watching what middleware means, because I know, but I reckon most of us won't. So tell us a bit about that, because it's quite an interesting twist that people won't have come across.
Well, I led a Stanford working group on platform scale a couple of years ago, and we came up with this idea that other people have also put forward, that instead of having three big platforms, Twitter, Google, and Facebook, do content moderation according to algorithms that are completely non-transparent, you ought to outsource that function to a competitive layer of third-party companies that could moderate content the way you wanted it to be. So if you're left of center, you'd have one set of things that you saw. If you're right of center, you'd have another. If you're pro-environment, or if you wanted to buy only sustainable goods, you could have the search engine make those choices for you rather than leaving it up to these big IT companies. And as I've thought about it more, this is really the only solution to the content moderation problem, because content moderation is hugely important. It has to happen. Otherwise, your internet, what you see on the internet, is just going to be total garbage. Right now, we're relying on these platforms to do it, but they really don't have the legitimacy to play that function. They're private, for-profit companies. They don't have the best interest of democracy at heart. That's not what they're about. It's bad enough, in Europe and in the United States where people are paying attention, but these companies have huge effects. Facebook has had a big effect in the Philippines, in India, in many other parts of the world, and not always in favor of democracy. On the other hand, you don't want to turn that content moderation function to the government. That's kind of a fundamental aspect of free speech. The government is not the arbiter of what is acceptable speech in a liberal democracy. And that's why I think that the idea that you should have a competitive, pluralistic layer of content moderators is really the only, I think, solution that makes sense, from a normative standpoint. Whether there's a business model that supports that, that's the thing I'm not sure of. And
would people pay for the filtering? Though, I suppose, in a sense, I mean, the precedent is there with internet service providers for a long time doing content filtering. If you're in work, you might find that certain sites, The Onion or something, will be banned because there could be naughty words on there, or other places will be banned because there could be naughty pictures on there, and so on. And so we're kind of familiar with that notion of having that. But I suppose you're saying that you make a trade of, or a marketplace of. You could opt into the one that suits you. And that's a little bit, I mean, some of the alternatives to Twitter were kind of more federated, and people could set their own rules, or the owner of the server could set their own rules and so on. But it really seems quite haphazard in a sense. And it also doesn't offer the protection, does it, to, I mean, the people who are being exploited by all of this, you don't have as good links back in to say, this is criminal, this is kind of, there are child protection issues with this. People are getting exploited. You don't have the same links back into criminal justice from...
No, I think you would. I mean, even if you had a competitive middleware layer, you still have criminal law, and you still say no platform can host, violent incitements to violence or illegal activities. You can't advertise, hard drugs on the internet. And I think you can still maintain those kinds of prohibitions that all middleware companies would have to follow. But certainly when you get into the political sphere, where you've got these complex judgments about what's acceptable political speech or not, that's where really there isn't a single obvious path forward, and you need some pluralism in the way that you moderate that kind of content. And I think that's where the pluralism in this middleware idea is really important, because we disagree about things, and freedom of speech, and I think that was actually the original version of the internet, or vision of the internet, that we'd have all sorts of different places where people could congregate, exchange ideas. Unfortunately, the economics of scale created these gigantic global platforms in which one company had huge power over audiences, all across the globe. And that's the unexpected thing that happened that I think we've somehow got to reverse and deal with.
Though perhaps when we come back to the less liberal democracies, they would want to set up their own competitive mandatory filter for Iran or for Egypt or for wherever, to say that you can have access to Twitter and Facebook and so on, but we will mandatorily strip out all the stuff that we don't want you to see. So the Great Firewall of China could be replicated in a sense.
Well, the governments could try to do that, but if you had real middleware providers, people could actually in those countries sign up for one that gave them, real news. They'd have to use a VPN or something. But I think, in a way, this is how you get around government censorship, by having alternatives to just one provide. Because right now the platforms are really, they can be intimidated by a big, powerful government, like that of India or China. Certainly, China has managed to create a completely separate internet. If you had more competition in this sector, I think it would be harder for an authoritarian government to really control the flow of information.
So as we kind of wrap up, the kind of social media is both good and bad in terms of its ability to allow anybody unmediated to actually get information out of countries, out of their situation. It also allows misinformation to be kind of spread and so on. When you look at liberalism, when you look at those kind of the fundamental tenets of it, are we in a good place, do you think? I mean, I know you had to write a book in order to kind of explore and remind people that there are dangers and there are threats. But overall, when you're marking its homework, are we in a good place, or are we just kind of having a midlife crisis in a sense?
Well, I guess the way I think about it, you can't predict the future, but I would say that liberalism has been around for several hundred years because the alternatives really look worse. If you have a government that wants to set a single cultural standard, a single strong national identity, a single religion, you're really asking for trouble in the kind of pluralistic world that we live in these days. And that's why I think there's an enduring strength to liberalism. I mean, you look at what Modi is doing in India right now, trying to shift the national identity to one based on a single religion. It's just a formula for endless communal conflict. And it kind of takes you back to the reasons why liberalism arose in the first place, is really to regulate that kind of conflict. So I think for those sorts of reasons, I still have a little bit of confidence that people eventually will realize that the alternatives to a liberal political order, look worse.
Yeah. So if you want to read more about the identity stuff, very good book on identity I've read by a man who knows his stuff, and Liberalism and Its Discontents gets a recommendation from me as kind of well. Imagine Festival is running for the week. Strangely, we've bookended it with you're kind of at the beginning and Noam Chomsky is at the end, which I think is a major mistake. We should have accidentally put you on at the same time, put you in the same room. I mean, what kind of questions should we be asking Chomsky? I mean, what are from his worldview and yours, what are the things he should be challenged on?
Well, he's really not had a very helpful position on Ukraine lately. And I do think that, a lot of his idea, although you can understand the unhappiness with the injustices of the current order, I'm not sure that his solutions are actually ones that would work under current conditions and wouldn't actually make things worse. So I think, there's still a lot to be said for you know, yeah, I mean, there's certain solutions that have been tried, and I think most of his solutions have already, been attempted and haven't worked terribly well. I guess that's what I would say.
Well, viewers can come back on Saturday night and find out whether or not they are convinced or unconvinced by Noam Chomsky. But for tonight, Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thank you for joining us at Imagine Belfast. If you're watching and the date on your calendar is the 20-something of March, then the festival's probably still on. Check out the rest of the programme at imaginebelfast.com. I'll be back later on in the week talking to George Monbiot, Lee Reynolds, and some fella called Noam Chomsky, who a lot of you have signed up and are very keen to hear about too. But for today, Francis, thank you so much and best wishes.
Thank you very much for having me.